Hey everybody, it's Bren and Dan. We're back for episode 3 of Display Case. So talk a little bit about what is on the slate for today's show. So we're going to be, our guest for today is Cliff Watson. He leads TU's youth engagement efforts as part of their Five Rivers program, which is their collegiate-focused program, helping start and help run, fly fishing clubs at campuses all over the United States, and I think they have some international clubs too, which is really cool. So we're going to hear from Cliff. Cliff's going to talk a little bit about what the Five Rivers program is all about. Dan was part of a Five Rivers club. Actually, I didn't realize helped start a Five Rivers club at University of Pittsburgh. So we'll talk about that. And then, as we get through the show, we're also going to talk a little bit about sort of a very interesting facet of the Five Rivers story, which is that really it got started in the southeastern portion of the U.S., which is probably not what comes to mind initially when you think of, cold water fisheries that are sort of steeped with lore and tradition. So I think we'll talk about we'll dive into that. We've got an awesome article that we just put up to the stream that kind of dovetails nicely with that. It's all about fishing in the Smokies. So we're going to talk about that. There's some cool stuff in there about some very unique flies, Appalachian flies, that we had never heard of. And that kind of made us want to talk about flies in our fisheries that maybe other people haven't heard of but are sort of well known. So we'll kind of get into that, and then we'll wrap things up a little bit, just kind of piggybacking on that, talking about other cool fisheries that maybe don't sort of fit the bill in terms of, again, like the lore and tradition, but maybe are, today is actually when those traditions are being founded. So it's kind of we'll talk a little bit about some interesting fisheries that we've experienced. So we'll start off, we'll get into it. We're going to hear from Cliff right now. Cliff's going to talk a bit about what the program's all about. And then we'll come back and Dan will talk about his experience. All right, let's roll the tape.
Yeah, so the TU Coast to Five Rivers program really was started by one individual named Franklin Tate. And 2011, Franklin was the director of the Headwaters Youth Program for Trout Unlimited, and recognized that there was this gap in engagement. TU had been working with elementary school students and the Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts, but there was this college-aged gap that wasn't being worked with, right? And these were students that were graduating high school, getting out of their house, and starting to pursue the things they really cared about and finding what they cared about, right? And a lot of them were finding that fly fishing and conservation was something that held deep meaning to them. So Franklin, living in Asheville, North Carolina at the time, started Five Rivers in the southeast and really went door to door to these southeast schools, starting this program of college fly fishing clubs centered around conservation, right? Building a community around fly fishing that cares about conservation and cares about creating this future generation of conservation-focused anglers. So Franklin got things going, and then in 2014 or 15, Costa Sunglasses came in and became the title sponsor. And that was really the ignition spark that launched Five Rivers to a national scale, because it allowed Trout Unlimited to hire a full-time program director, right? So the first hire was Andrew Lafredo, who was the Five Rivers coordinator during my time as a student. But Andrew really took the program from this southeastern-focused group of a couple college fly fishing clubs and found every college fly fishing club in the country, right? Yeah. Well, the goal of Five Rivers and the goal of the Headwaters Youth Program of Trout Unlimited is to build a generation of conservation-minded anglers, right? Anglers that they love to fish, right? But first and foremost, they recognize that their love of fishing doesn't exist without the protection of this resource that they rely on, right? So certainly it's a continuation of that mission, right, for the future of Five Rivers, of Trout Unlimited, and of all of our youth programs, is to build these conservation-minded anglers to take care of this resource as we all grow up and and are no longer able to do so. We need our grandkids to do so. So within that, I would love to see substantial growth within the program, and I think it's almost low-hanging fruit to say that as like a goal or like a something I want to achieve, but I think it's really true. I want to see growth without sacrificing the depth. Five Rivers does such a good job of keeping its mission of conservation-minded anglers core to every single club, and actively growing the program in a way that doesn't sacrifice that mission, right? I think with a lot of growth mindsets, it's easy to set aside the mission purely seeking numbers, right? But for me, it's how can we, start another fly fishing club and make that one of the best fly fishing clubs on that campus, right? As opposed to just getting random clubs everywhere. I want 80 to 100 of the best clubs on college campuses to be Five Rivers fly fishing clubs, right? So continuing to do that while simultaneously growing the recognition for the Five Rivers program and the work that Trout Unlimited does. TU does an impressive amount of conservation work, and our youth programs impact an incredible amount of people. Just this past year, we had 125,000 young people come through the doors of TU youth programs. Everything from Trout in the Classroom to Stream Girls with the Girl Scouts, Stream Keepers, Stream Explorers. We've got great high school programs now. We've got Five Rivers. So we're impacting over 100,000 students a year, and I want to continue that. And I also want people to know that, right? So that they know that when they grow up and have kids, there's a place for their kids to go learn about fly fishing, learn about conservation, and learn about community. I see those three things as core to what we do at Five Rivers and in all of our youth programs. Is how can we build community, how can we build conservation-minded anglers, and use fly fishing to do that.
Let's start with your experience. I was not part of a fly fishing club in college. You were. It was obviously a big part. You still hang out with buds that you were in that club with in college. I think it's how you potentially met your significant other. So talk a little bit about your experience with the club and how it was sort of part of your formation as an angler.
Yeah. Actually, our Panther fly fishing on at the University of Pittsburgh, they just turned 10 for years active in the club, which is something that the group of us that started it never really, we hoped, but never really were like that optimistic that it would keep going. And under the leadership of a bunch of really passionate people, and it's kept going. And what's cool is now the people that are running it, I didn't recruit. We didn't bring them into the club. They're like third generation, completely removed from the founding group. And it's just really cool to see something that you helped build keep going. But the story of how Panther fly fishing came about was honestly just kind of was lacking a sense of community and camaraderie on campus. Like, I was involved in a fraternity, but we did the normal fraternity stuff, and I was more interested in trying to figure out how to get off campus.
Yeah.
And Pitt is urban. Like, we're right in the middle of town, which is awesome. But unless you have a car, you can't get anywhere outside to do like fly fishing, climbing, rafting, whatever we wanted to do. So my dad at the time was the president of his Trout Unlimited chapter. And someone from TU National must have come through and talked about these new youth opportunities. And this Five Rivers program came up. And my dad, being the natural volunteer that he is, was like, my son will start one. And he reached out, and I was like, I think this would be cool to try and meet some people that, don't just drink in the same bars as me, but are interested in the same sort of outdoor activities and getting outside and prioritizing that. And so it's pretty funny. I talked to the people at Five Rivers. They helped me write all of the chartering docs to send into the school, got everything papered, put $100 in the bank account to let us run. And then I was like, all right, now the hard part, finding these people. And this was just me. So I would turn to my network of fraternity guys and sorority girls, and I was like, who do you know that fly fishes? Like, I didn't care who they were.
I didn't realize you started it. That's cool. I didn't realize you actually started it. I just thought you were a part of it. So that's awesome.
No, yeah, I was one of the 4 founders. And so I was like, cool, met like 2 guys. It's like, hey, I'm trying to start this. They're like, awesome. One of them you've met, Austin.
Yep.
He's my cheeky fishing partner. He was one of the first people. He was in another fraternity, and somebody's like, Austin fishes. You need to talk to him. And so we set up. I went in front of the Outdoors Club, which is at Pitt was everybody climbing, hiking, biking, kind of general catch-all for crunchy kids. And I'm like, cool. The president gets up and he's like, hey, this is Dan. He's going to talk to you about killing fish. And I was like, hey, thank you, dude. First thing was like, I'm not killing any fish. We're going fishing. And then that's where I met another co-founder. And then it kind of just picked up from there. And before I think any of us knew it, I wasn't paying fraternity dues anymore, and I was hanging out with the Panther fly fishing guys. And long story short, after hundreds of hours of the water together, one of my co-founders married my sister. The other co-founder was in my wedding. I hang out
Very
with
cool.
Austin every year at the Cheeky tournament. And it really took, the narrative of like, if you go join a fraternity, you're going to find your friends for life. That wasn't the case for me, but I found it in the fly fishing club. And we just started going to events. We started going fishing every weekend. Again, most of us were stoked that 4 of us had cars. And so we just kept going. Weekends quickly turned from like staying out super late to like staying out till midnight and then waking up at 4 in the morning to try and run up to Lake Erie to go steelhead fishing. And it's just cascaded from there. Like I said, they just celebrated 10 years in April. And it's really cool to see that grow. And like you said, I met my wife through Five Rivers. She was in another chapter at Frostburg State University in Western Maryland. She was the president of her club at that time. Somebody was like, hey, Dan, Morgan lives near you. You guys should go fish. I was looking, again, the whole reason I started it was to find people to fish with. And then that just kept going from there. So I think without the Five Rivers program, I wouldn't be working with you. I wouldn't be here.
Cool.
And it just extremely formative, but just put me in the right places where I needed to be at certain points in time, to end up where I'm sitting right now.
All right. So the next thing with piggybacking on Dan, your experience in the fly fishing clubs, Cliff's in a great position, having he's working with college students today. He's helping start clubs. He's helping advise clubs. So I think we have a perspective at the museum about how young people are engaging with our content and what motivates them and what seems to resonate. But we definitely wanted to ask Cliff, right? Because Cliff is in the best position possible. So here's Cliff talking about where he feels like the kind of new generation of anglers are in terms of their appreciation of history, their interest to learn more about it, and how that relates to their growth as anglers.
Yeah, it's a really good question. It was hard for me to answer because I think that there is this, and to say that young people don't care about the history or don't care about the legends of the sport would be inaccurate, because I don't think that we as fly anglers and the community and the industry have done our part to educate the young generation about the history, about what is fly fishing, where does it come from, how does it work. For example, I live in Bellingham, Washington, and my home river is the Skagit River, right? And I, moved out there not really knowing the history of spay fishing, of, Skagit tips and the uniqueness of what that fishery is. But without people like Ed Ward and the guides and the anglers that, came up with this idea of let's fish really short, heavy tips so that we can fish this deep water with big flies and big fish and, limited room for back cast. So, essentially I think the fly fishing community at large can work together to do a better job to educate young people about the history. These days with the internet at our fingertips, and a fly shop on almost every corner in these places, information is so accessible that it doesn't require, reading the books or asking the old guy on the corner like how this works. So I think we can all do a little bit of a better job, teaching, to get this younger generation more engaged. But I will say, I think that there's a strong desire from this next generation, to learn and to be engaged. I think, this is a little bit of a hot take, but I think that's kind of fun on a podcast. I see people getting pretty tired of the $1,000 fly rod, double rod vault on the Toyota Tacoma, crisp waders, all these things, and they're looking for someone that brings 10 flies to the river and a backpack, a JanSport backpack, and is, got their Vans on and is just trying it out, figuring it out, learning how to do it. Much like the people who started this sport did, right? There weren't any manuals. They figured it out on their own. They learned on the river. And I think this next generation is really powerfully connected to that because they see the value in it and they recognize that, it's really easy to get information these days, but it's way more fulfilling and way more fun to go out and learn it and do it on your own and just get dirty and fail, relentlessly, right? Fail, get back up, try again. Let that trout eat your dry fly 20 times, miss the hook set, and then finally get him on the 21st time, right?
So I kind of have a thought on this, but yeah, I'm going to give the floor to you first. Like, what was your reaction? Do you kind of agree with Cliff's assessment? Do you feel like you were in a club? Do you feel like since you were in a club, things have changed in terms of how people getting started in fly fishing are learning about the history?
I think a little bit. I think it's hard to be a Pennsylvanian and not be connected to it at least a little bit. We're pretty deeply steeped in fly fishing history. But I think it really stems from a curiosity of, like, my interest in fly fishing history in the States started with, like, how long have these fish been migrating in this river? How long have they been here? Who's caught them before? What are they trying things that have been forgotten that now I should go back and try because nobody fishes with a floating woolly bugger, or nobody fishes with like this gaudy fly, but those fish ate it 200 years ago. They've probably forgotten since then. They've seen 1,000 size 22 perdigons, but they haven't seen a sow bug in a year. So to me, it was looking to the past to try and find people who had solved problems that I was having now. And just being curious about who named this pool. Why is this called Vince's Meadow? Why is it called, what made this river so interesting to these guys 100 years ago? And also just like, what did this place used to be? Like, I think with our generation, we hear a lot of like, whether it's climate change or development or whatever else, the streams that we're touching today more than likely are impaired from where they were when these people were writing about
for
them.
Sure.
So it's interesting to go back and transport yourself to like, what was this like? And I think that only fuels my engine for conservation or river restoration or a passion for wild fish, because you're like, it was that way. How close can we get it to that again?
Yeah.
I think that's what fascinates me.
Yeah. No, so I think even beyond the conservation point, right? I think it definitely landed with me, this sense that, when we were getting started, I think obviously, we had more material available to us than our parents, right? But, I still like reading Lefty's book on saltwater fly fishing, reading Jack Artside books. I think a lot of the way we absorbed history was kind of through the narrative of these legends, and it was more just about their journey, right? Like
Hmm.
how like the things they tried, the kind of the ground they were breaking. There wasn't the gear wasn't up to par of what it is today. I mean, a lot of the saltwater guys, they didn't have boats. Like they had to actually kind
Yeah.
of invent boats in order to get closer to the fish and not spook them out. And so I think when Cliff was saying that, it kind of this light went off in my head at least, which was it's interesting that maybe that is the way we absorbed it, or the way like a museum presents it is so valuable because it's more about the journey. And today I do think there's this aspect like Cliff is mentioning where there's so much information that everyone's kind of in the forums saying, oh, there's no way you can use that taper on that $150 line with on that $2,000 rod. It's never going to work. And like the reality is that it's splitting hairs that are already split, and it's like what
Yeah.
actually resonates with a lot of anglers is more that putting yourself kind of like you're saying too in the shoes of these legends that they were not worried about that, like they were just out there trying to figure out how to feed the fish, what the fish were doing, whether it's scouting, just on the water, not even fishing, seeing what's happening, sitting through tide cycles. And I think as anglers, I think a lot of us are happiest when we're more, we're not on the water being like, oh, I picked the wrong taper. You know what I mean? We're trying to execute on something, and it's in all likelihood like very a similar challenge that kind of like you're saying, someone else before you already solved it, but like the fun part is going through that. And so I felt like when Cliff was saying that, it made me think too, like how, especially AMFF, how can we lean more into like the stories, like the journeys that people can connect with. Again, as a way to like offset just the raw amount of information on such a granular niche level that maybe you unwittingly get sucked into the more you get into the sport.
Yeah, and I think I completely agree. I think you can get overshadowed by, you know, thousands of armchair experts when in the past it was just there were like three that wrote books and you're like that's how we did it.
Yep.
And I find it so interesting when you're looking at things like that with like how did they solve this problem before? What were they trying to do? Well, it's like they were just throwing ideas up against a wall. They were jamming steel rods up the butt of a fiberglass rod to try and land a tarpon.
Yep.
They were welding lead core line onto the end of a floating line to try and make a sink tip. I think it's so cool to say that like, at a certain point, so much of our sport is based on like, you know, necessity is the mother of invention. Like you just have what's in front of you, you have what's in your bag. How are you going to do that? No amount of scrolling on your phone is going to get you to the answer if you're standing on a jetty,
Yep.
right? So it's like all you got is that. You gotta get it done, and I think that's what's so cool about. Um, Again, to me, it's just looking back at these problems that have been solved, or it's just like the solution to what's in front of you is not again the new line that you just picked up. Perhaps it's like the leader or the fly or how you present it or doing everything in a manner that the fish haven't seen in a while.
Yeah.
That I
Or they're
think is
just
really
reacting to that day, right? Just whatever's motivating them that day.
like
Because
I
it's
bet
different.
I bet some of the flies that we're going to talk about down the way, like probably haven't been thrown in my local river, probably ever. Am I going to go tie one and try it? Absolutely, because that fish has
Yeah.
never seen that before. He might just go like, I've never seen that. All they have is their mouth to inspect stuff. So, looking to the past for these little niche flies and unique things that people have tested out. That in the past the only way it circulated was through publications like ours. Otherwise, that fly never left the valley.
So Dan, I'm gonna we're gonna listen to another clip from Cliff. And I thought this is a really interesting. I certainly had no idea. Maybe you have had more of an idea because you were involved with the program, but I actually didn't really know much about the history of the Five Rivers program, and so I sort of innocently just asked, as we're getting started to do this, I kind of asked Cliff, just yeah, basically super high level, how did this all get started? And in my head, I'm thinking, okay, that the clubs are going to be like Montana State and Penn State and all the places that you feel like that's where it would get started, and so he said no, actually it got started in the Southeast, which fascinated me, and so we're going to listen to Cliff talking about a clip of that and sort of why that is so interesting, and how those clubs are still some of the most active clubs in the whole network. So let's listen to that and then we'll come back and we'll chat. All right, here's Cliff.
It's really interesting because the clubs in the Southeast today, and I do my best to not play favorites by any means, right? But the clubs in the Southeast are still very strong and have this really powerful connection to the history of the program, right? Clubs at Sewanee, Western Carolina University, Appalachian State, they're really ingrained in Five Rivers in a way that some of our newer clubs aren't. I think at the same time, because the Southeast isn't as recognized as like this much of a trout fishery, despite it having incredible native brook trout fishing, right, and some really good opportunities to catch delayed harvest rainbows and browns and things like that. It doesn't have that recognition, so those clubs down there, they lean into the conservation and community elements more than our clubs out west do, right? I went to the University of Colorado Boulder, and we were really a fishing club, I won't lie. We did creek cleanups and things like that, but the students in the Southeast are really leaning into like doing conservation projects with their local Trout Unlimited chapter, right? Doing river restoration projects, rolling rocks, planting trees, things like that, because it's not as robust of a fishery as you have in Colorado or Wyoming and Montana, right? Or even in like State College in Pennsylvania, where you've got trout streams everywhere. The Southeast students have to find a way to still engage, and to do that, they lean into the conservation and the community elements.
All right, so Dan, kind of listening to that clip, knowing what you know about the program as just a participant, like what was your reaction, and had you thought about this before, just having been part of the Five Rivers program, or is this sort of stepping back? What's interesting about how it got started, but more specifically where it got started?
Yeah, I mean, if you know anything about East Coast fly fishing, the Southern Appalachians are often spoken about, but not. I think it's just a really avid fishing community. You have so many of those big cities that are like Atlanta's 2 hours to southeast, like the Southern Appalachians, where you can get into really good tailwater fishing. There's a trout tailwater in Atlanta, and they have these after the Great Depression. They put in all these big hydroelectric projects, either for flood control or to generate power. And what happened is they created these cold water tailouts, and naturally, being a really area deeply rooted in sporting, people are like, let's put trout in those. And that paired with all of the great brook trout fishing and blue lining available on coming off of the Appalachians, you end up with these really incredible fisheries and just high numbers of them. You can go up unnamed tributaries constantly, and explore new areas. So I think they already had this wealth of young people that were hunters, anglers, whether it was bass fishing, and whatever else, that were already kind of inclined to just find people who wanted to do that with them. And I think through that and through other programs, Trout Unlimited is very active down the Appalachians, restoring rivers, doing cleanups. That volunteerism heartbeat is strong in that area.
Yeah.
So I think it was just a natural fit. And then Franklin Tate, which he was one of the people that helped me found my club. He was based in I want to say Asheville, and so it was a natural kind of center for where everything grew out from. And it's just a beautiful area. Our club used to do our annual spring break trip was drive as far south as we could in one night down the Appalachians and fish our way back north.
That's cool. Yeah, that's cool. I think I thought, Cliff's point just being that because it's a treasured fishery, right, to the folks that are there that are fishing it, and it breeds this even more kind of maniacal conservation attitude, which is really cool. And I thought one thing that was kind of going through my head as Cliff was talking about this is I think the analogy that a lot of people use in the conservation space is sort of you as an angler, you want to catch fish, then you want to catch lots of fish, then you only want to catch big fish, and then you want to save the fish, right? That's kind of like the classic thing that people talk about, and I think it's attributed to Joan Wolfe, attributed to other people, but it's a common analogy. And as when Cliff was talking about how even the young anglers there are realizing like how special that fishery is, and the history of it and how it needs to be protected. Conservation is so actually kind of a bedrock principle as very early anglers. So it's kind of inverting that analogy a little bit. It's like they're even at the fish just want to catch fish stage, they're thinking about conservation. So I thought to me that was kind of cool and inspiring, and just made me think about that whole analogy a little bit different, and just again puts in perspective the health and sort of the threat of the fishery, how that relates to where it is, the history of it, and how that changes anglers, and their just fundamental perspective on conservation.
Yeah, and I think the nice thing with the clubs, especially in colleges, it is a built-in like social outlet. So when you join that club because you're like, I love fishing, I'm gonna join the App State Fly Fishing Club. Generally, in that first couple of weeks, one of the first things we would do is to be a part of Five Rivers, you have to run a project every year, whether it's a cleanup or tree planting or some like clinics to teach people, something like that.
Yep.
So right out of the gate, one of the first events you're exposed to as a new member is something giving back to the space. And then at that point, you're like, well, I've invested this many hours into planting these trees. I'm going to get my return and I'm going to go fishing and see those changes in practice. And I think that's really good because those first events are very social. It's just you working as a team to accomplish something greater than yourself. And that camaraderie, immediately you feel that and you're like, I want to keep going back to there.
Yeah. All right. So again, obviously this just that initial take was very powerful, and it got me thinking about an article that we just posted to the stream, actually, which is coincidental. It wasn't done. We had posted that article before we talked to Cliff, and so it made me think. And it's we'll make sure to include a link here. I believe the title is "Fishing Under the Rhododendron Skies," something to that effect. And it's an awesome article that we pulled out of the journal that we've kind of had our eye on for a little bit, and it's really just the history of fishing in the Smokies, also just the history of the park and how that got started, and it's it's actually kind of a winding road. It's an interesting story, and it has a conservation angle, just talking about what had happened to the wild fish populations and why, and also just kind of again, like you were saying, how it did kind of create this real ethos of hunting and fishing and outdoors, outdoor activities, and so. We can talk a little bit about just the article in general, but one of the things that stuck out to me when I just posted it, even before we talked to Cliff, was, they talk about this fly called the yellow hammer fly. And I'm like, oh, I've never heard of that fly. Do a quick look, search. It's definitely an odd fly, and clearly, like right off the bat, you're like, okay, that's not imitative. That's in an attractor. It's very impressionistic, but and so the article goes into it and talks about it, and so everyone should read the article. And in there, actually, there's a line from a book that Mary Orvis Marbury wrote, famous for her fly panels that we obviously have in the museum and we talk a lot about, where she was talking about the Native Americans had a kind of similar fly where they would palmer a strip of deer hair with the, you know, barbs facing towards the eye of the hook. And so anyway, so I had asked a bunch of people, you ever heard of this fly? And not one person knew about it. So, and this is when we first, posted the article. So that's going to be awesome. And so it got me thinking about flies. So we'll talk about sort of what's the equivalent to the yellowhammer in our own fisheries. But I guess just right off the bat, what were your reactions to that article? What did you find interesting, especially in relation to, the conversation we have with Cliff?
Well, I've been, number one, I think relating to the clubs in the Southeast, the Smokies is one of the last places in the Southeast that you can actually A, get lost, but B, actually has the need for a roadless search and rescue team to come find you if something were to happen. I've hiked into them. There are places up there where the article talks about clear cutting and what detriment that was to a lot of those streams. And there are spots in that park where you can hike up over a ridge that they never got a logging road to. And the trees go from 100 years old to 300 years old.
Yeah.
And it's like a foot difference to either side of the ridge. And it gets old and it gets spooky up there. And in like the most deeply kind of spiritual way. And the Appalachians have been written about like that for hundreds of years. But when the park first came out, like there were some of these trails that we were following to these like unnamed tributaries that are above waterfalls. So the brook trout there have never been molested by a rainbow.
Yeah.
You go up in there and you're on a logging road from the 1800s that they put in so they could get to a lodge where the ruins are. You can maybe find them if you look hard enough and punch through the rhododendrons. And it's just such a history place, and that history precedes settlement. Like the Cherokee up there, like you mentioned, we're chasing those brook trout up in these headwater tributaries. We're fishing for them with flies that they tied, and it's every time I go there, I'm like just a little bit more in awe of what that place is. But that park itself is such a resource for people to go and explore, where in those areas that were so inhabited and inhibited by industry that they can still go and see a wild place.
Yeah, 100%. 100%. I think I think you captured that. You captured the scene perfectly. All right, so back to that fly in particular. Again, everyone should read this article. It's really awesome. It's like
weird spiky guy.
Yeah, it's great. I can't recommend it highly enough. And so it gets the name yellowhammer comes from the bird, which is now a protected bird, so you can't tie flies with these feathers anymore. But it's a yellow-tailed woodpecker, which they are a type of woodpecker, and they had a unique thing where their tail feather, one side was black, one side was bright yellow. And so there's kind of two. Again, you should read the article, but I'll kind of quickly just describe it. There's sort of two variations of this fly. One is just one of these feathers palmered up the hook with the barbs facing the hook of the eye, and that's it. And then there's kind of another newer version, but still going way back, where there's a pheasant tail and body with peacock herl, and then kind of the same woodpecker feather, but palmered more like you would a normal hackle. So not as much with the forward orientation. And I think both are considered yellowhammers. It's known to a lot of locals as yallerhammer, which apparently is just based on the pronunciation of yellow, back then, which is kind of cool. And there's some other flies they talk about in there that are unique to the area. And again, I felt like it was so cool just that, at least in my little test, no one had ever heard about it. But the fact that it was, Mary Orvis Marbury knew about it is really cool, for one. And yeah, it got me thinking about, I'm like, okay, this would be fun. Dan and I, let's go way back to when we just got started fishing. What were the first flies you tied? Like, that all the people you learn from, what did they fish, and we'll kind of go back and forth. So I'll let you start, and I'm curious if I know about them or not. But yeah, why don't you start? Like what's your version of the yellowhammer?
I've got two that kind of stand out to me, and one is gonna be familiar to a lot of people because it became really, really popular. And it's gonna put a really fun full circle on this. It came out of the Raven Fork in Cherokee, North Carolina, in the Smoky Mountains.
Okay.
And its name is the mop fly.
Okay.
And it's a ubiquitous pattern
Yep.
now.
Yep.
This was before Instagram, before social media. There were these guys down there, and again, this will probably spark a comment section similar to like, did Lefty invent the deceiver?
Yeah.
I'm sure somebody else tied a chenille finger to the end of a hook and called it something else. But for about 5 years there, you couldn't buy them. You had to tie them, and so it was limited to like either if you knew how to tie those flies or you knew a buddy who would tie them. And I had one from a friend, absolutely cleaned up on stock trout when I was like first starting out. I was like, this is the cheat code. Since then, the trout have gotten a little smarter. But, for that, it was so much fun because it was the reason I bought a vise and hooks and tungsten was because I wanted to tie this fly to fish it in Pennsylvania. And that's just a cool one that has since exploded. It has its own cheerleaders and it has its own peanut gallery. I use them as split shot with a hook when you need it. But they're excellent little flies.
Yep.
And then, so that's a cool piece of modern history that's come out of the Smokies that has since spread to the rest of the country. The other one that I don't think a lot of people know the advent of is still Appalachian, but it's the hopper. The Letort Creek or Letort Spring Run is in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, along the Appalachian Trail that actually crosses it.
Okay.
Way back, they started noticing that, early terrestrial fly designers were noticing just ants were coming in the water. Trout weren't just rising to mayflies; they were eating bugs that fell in. And so these guys started the Letort hopper. And for a little while, it was one of those like well-kept secrets. Guys were fishing it, having an excellent time in August when the bugs weren't going below the water surface, but above the surface, they were going crazy. Since then, that style of fishing has gone internet global. The hopper dropper wouldn't have existed without the Letort hopper in the 1800s. And so that sort of thing to me is fascinating because this tiny little chalk stream in Pennsylvania is the advent of the flies that you all were fishing at the One Fly in Jackson last year, right?
Yeah.
Like foam hoppers. The West would not be fished the way it is were it not for this little limestone creek in Pennsylvania.
That's cool. I did not think you were going to say the mop fly and a hopper, so that's cool. That's surprising. So okay. See if you kind of know mine. So, I'm going to split it kind of salt and cold, but in a lot of ways it's kind of the same fly. So it's again sort of a little bit circular. But so I'm Northeast, saltwater guy, kind of an originally, but my family's from Maine, so kind of I've done a lot of cold water too. And I think for thinking back to when I bought a vise, first flies I ever tied, a lot of them are probably like the usual suspects. If you fish down this way, learn how to tie the Pamit special. That's like a classic one that I was introduced to really early. Other ones would be like bonito bunnies, bunny style deceivers, kind of like specific to my neck of the woods. Major herring flies. Stuff like that, usual suspects. But for sure, the one that I tied the most when I got started, and the one that I feel like, the people I learned how to fish from, like the kind of person that just like, I only fish one fly, literally never change anything else. And they're like, Bren, you only need one fly, and it kind of like as a young angler, you're like, that's cool. What is it? And it's actually a Florida fly. It's a snook fly. It's like a dock lights fly. It's the schminnow. So the
Okay.
schminnow which it's similar to like a flash minnow. Very impressionist. Like isn't any one thing. It was invented by a guy Norm Ziegler. And he's a Florida guy. I think he actually just passed R.I.P. Norm last year, and he's from Sanibel, owned a fly shop. Very well known down there. And it's incredibly simple. It's a marabou tail with some estaz palmered up with some dumbbell eyes. It can kind of pass as pretty much anything. And man, I tied so many of those flies, in just different colors. And I think Norm himself claims that he's personally caught like 34 different species on this fly. But I've pretty much caught everything with it. And it just for me, it's again like uh, for whatever reason, it just had a real hold on sort of the southeastern Mass, Rhode Island, Cape crowd. There's just this like group of people like schminnows all day long. It's all you need. And they were kind of right. You could pretty much catch anything. I think these
Yeah.
days I still fish them sometimes. These days kind of use it more on the buggy side of the spectrum, like for more like the minnow patterns. I have sort of transitioned more to like more neutrally buoyant patterns that don't have dumbbell eyes and things like that. Oh, there's the cat. We know the cat would surface at some point.
Well,
Uh,
if you Google it, the first article that comes up is from Hatch magazine, and it's Schminnow, the fly, the only fly you need. Like, it's world famous.
yeah. So again, I don't think that's one a lot of people know about. But there's a certain crowd, at least the one I learned to fly fish from, that was like half the people on any given day in the boat were fishing schminnow flies. On the cold water side, I mentioned my family's has roots in Maine, and it's actually like kind of the same. It's the same materials. It's marabou estaz instead of dumbbell eyes. It's a bead head, and that is a golden retriever fly. And so that
Oh yeah.
is right. So okay, that's so you've heard of that one. And
Oh yeah.
that is one that I was introduced to early. It slays, but any kind of warm water species. Brook trout love it. The native brook trout love it, especially in the smaller sizes. Landlocked salmon chomp on it with reckless
Yeah.
abandonment. And again, it's kind of funny because it's kind of the same ingredients, obviously a different color. It's tied more like in that tan golden retriever style. But again, that's another one where I think if you were fish out west or something, you might not know what that is, but you get into a certain area, and again, probably half the people, it's their go-to pattern. So I think that's just again, the article is kind of interesting, and it's it's cool to kind of swap notes on what we first started tying and fishing with.
Yeah. No, I think that's like the coolest. Some of these patterns that maybe weren't written down or were local stuff like the yaller fly. Some of them, the only reason why we know how to tie them or anything like that is not because the person who invented them is here talking about it. It's because we have a physical evidence of that person designing it and fishing it. And like especially in Appalachian, with the history of like some of those early settlers were not literate. They weren't writing down what they were doing. They were just trying to survive and make those harsh mountains their home. And so like that's cool to have that piece of history to be like, okay, you guys were doing this, solving these same problems. Um, it's just cool that you have that connection with the person who taught you, the person who taught you, and whoever Norm first showed it to. You're connected to that tire
Yeah, right.
um, on a level, you know, that's just very special. It's something that I think fly tying is unique with is that you get um, almost assist points if you're the person whose fly caught that fish. You're like, I get some credit on that.
Yeah, totally, totally. So okay, so same sort of thread, but a little bit different. Because I think it's really cool that you actually the flies that you brought up again have these Appalachian roots, and I think you're obviously steeped in the history of it. And I think there's a I think the article that we posted that everyone should read. You know, the author talks about as a young person, you know, reading the magazines and kind of sort of all the storied waters were in Eastern Canada or New England. And then over time, it kind of became out West, sort of became like, you know, the place that you wanted to go to really connect with the roots of fly fishing. Obviously, you already have a deep appreciation for the Appalachians. And the author sort of talked about whenever they talk about the Smokies or Appalachians, it would be informative, but it would be, I think the line was something like lacking the lure and charm was
Yeah.
I think like the line he used, which is interesting. Obviously, there is lure, there is charm, and you know people are figuring it out. Again, that's why we exist. That's why AMF is around
Yeah.
to try to tell these stories. But it got me thinking. You know, can I think of one, or can you think of another fishery that is dynamite, is unheralded, is you know maybe lacking some of the lure and charm, but over indexing on just like straight up fun and just you know excitement around the fishery, and again maybe like the Appalachians, maybe the story is being told and we're kind of living it, you know, which is what makes it exciting relative to some of these other places where you feel like the story's already been written. So I'll kind of flip, question to you. What comes to mind when you think of another fishery that kind of fits that bill?
I
Lacking lore and
to
charm, but awesome.
I mean, I think like some low hanging fruit, like obviously carp is something that's really
Yeah.
fun to like practice sight fishing on to
Yep.
get. They're picky, but they're everywhere. They're probably in the pond behind the elementary school in your neighborhood. They're probably in the river 20 minutes down the road. They're probably in, uh, your neighbor's koi pond. They're an awesome fish that take immense amount of technical know-how. They're a demanding fish they fight really hard. You have to tie specific patterns for them or have specific patterns. They have their own tactics.
Yep.
Um, I think they're really cool. And they're terrible. They're not really good tasting, so nobody keeps them. So they get big. I think there's that. Um, I think in the fly side of it, I think bass, like black smallmouth, is something that's coming around. As more of our cold water streams transition into warmer water for more of the year, these smallmouth are these beautiful shoulder season fish that will take a dry fly. They'll take a nymph. They'll take a streamer. They'll take a popper. They're there, and like all of these rivers have them. In the southeast, all those tailwater systems have them, and they're always hungry. They're always willing to smack a fly.
Yep.
And then taking that like a step further is the landlocked stripers in the
Mm-hmm.
southeastern reservoir systems.
Yep.
Um, they're stripers who don't ever have to worry about another predator. So I have friends who are confident there's 100-pounder in one of those
Yep.
reservoirs down there. And it wouldn't surprise me based on the caliber of fish that I see people catch. But you can get them in the rivers when they're running. You can get them in the lake on blitzes. They're just kind of overshadowed because people think it's a gear game. Like you have to fish, to get the depths of those hundreds feet deep lakes.
Yep.
But like you'll find them in the situations that we do in the ocean, just busting up or running in the river. But they're
Yep.
also a cool thing that like your trout guide might be like, hey, you've caught a lot of these like 18 to 22-inch tailwater trout. You want to go for something that'll rip the rod out of your hands? And they
Yep.
show you some of these places. And it's cool, and they're ephemeral because they're only doing that for a certain part of the year, and then they go back to their other habits. And I think those three to me as and in fresh speaking specifically to like freshwater, I
Yeah.
think are like the most compelling.
That's awesome. So yeah, check, check, check. I think we had a lot of similar ideas there. Totally second your thought around carp. Definitely the hybrid striped bass. You know, if maybe folks don't know this, but we actually have two galleries, two campuses, one in Manchester, Vermont, and then one in Springfield, Missouri, as part of the Wonders of Wildlife, attached
Mm-hmm.
to the flagship Bass Pro. And so, you know, we've been down there, and the White River system has some, that watershed rather, has some unbelievable hybrid striped bass fishing. So that's definitely one. And then yeah, I think you're spot on with warm water. A couple episodes back we talked to Rachel Finn. She guides in the Sable out of the Hungry Trout shop, and she talked about how the bass fishery is getting so much better on the shoulders of the season when the water's getting a little bit warm, and how that's just created an entirely new set of opportunities. I'll throw a couple more at you, which I think on on the sort of carp side of things in terms of urban fishing, I think on the saltwater game, there's something very similar. Like I've only lived in cities, and there's always amazing fishing in cities. You mentioned
Yeah.
Atlanta. You talked about carp. You can chase carp outside of Boston and New York City. The New York City harbor is an unbelievable striped bass destination.
Yeah.
Um, totally kind of throws the context of structure, turns it on its head a little bit in terms of like the structure you're going after. Instead of rock piles, it's water pumps and things like this. But I always had a blast. I think urban fishing is a really cool, evolving game. But then, really, kind of, I guess my number one thought, because it is tricky to think about. Like again, so many fisheries have been discovered, right? There's no fishery that's amazing that no one's probably found. But one that came to mind that sort of again lacks maybe that when you think tradition, you think steeped in history, it doesn't jump out off the page at you, but it actually is amazing, is Lake Champlain in Vermont
Yeah.
in New York. Insanely cool fishery. When you think the New York side, you think the Ausable, you don't think Lake Champlain. When you think the Vermont side, you think the Bat and Kill, you think down into the Catskills, you think the Upper Dell. Like these are the areas that come to mind when you think New York in Vermont. Um, Obviously, I think for a while it was really just thought of as a warm water fishery, and the bass fishing is incredible, right? So as people have gotten more into that fishery, they've realized it. But I mean, beyond that, in addition to just there's so many ways. There's open water fishing with landlocked salmon. There's a resurgent muskie population. That there's tribs that have all kinds of fish in them. You can fish for trout. You can fish for like some really interesting. They have carp in there. I think there's something like 100 different species of fish
Oh
in
yeah,
the
there was
entire
a
system. There's white perch. And so, as I was kind of thinking about this question and thinking to myself, geez, if you had to kind of pick a place in the Northeast that was your one and only place to fish, gee, that seems like a pretty strong option in terms of it, and kind of like you're saying about hybrid striped bass. Maybe in the past people thought, oh, you can't get landlocked, salmon like that on the fly. But now we're finding ways to do it, and it's all about the season. Kudos to the cat. She's trying to make another appearance on the show. Um, it's all about the season and what they're doing and intercepting at the right time. And if there's enough different types of fish, it keeps you busy all the time.
yeah, and there's just always something going on. I've thought that about that whole. I mean, from Champlain West to Lake Erie, it's all the Finger Lakes have the same thing. There are all these places that it's like, oh, just where my grandparents used to go on vacation. But each of them has runs of lake run salmonids,
Yep.
has smallmouth, has walleye, has lake trout. Like,
Yep.
and sure, access is kind of difficult, but the quantity and caliber of fish available in them is something that has been kept not secret. It's just they're just kind of in the middle of they're between two big places, or
Yeah.
you drive past them to the Great Lakes. You drive through them to get to New England, and you just pass by these places that are just incredible fisheries. Like we're driving up to the Five Rivers Rendezvous this Friday, and we're gonna drive past like so many rivers that I'm gonna be like, we should stop there and fish. We should stop there and fish. We should stop there and fish. And you'll never have enough time to do that in one lifetime. And I think there's, as in fly fishing marketing, we've done a really great job at convincing people that they have to leave where they are to
Yeah.
experience great fishing. When the fact is, like, generally, if you look at your feet, you're going to find some really cool stuff, and you're going to be able to dedicate the time that is worthy of that fishery. to explore it.
And to bring it back full circle, right, to what we were talking about with Cliff about is, again, to get more in the head, more in the mindset of the legends who put in the time to problem solve and kind of work through everything to get to that level, which is just a whole nother level of appreciation, right, when you understand and know your fishery that well. So I think that's an awesome point. So I think that pretty much wraps it for today. Again, encourage everybody to go read the materials so you can kind of keep thinking about this stuff. We appreciate everyone kind of sticking out and getting through all this. And, if you have ideas for other cool fisheries that we should be talking about, let us know. Again, our mission is we're trying to pull back a little bit and look at all across the country how many amazing different fisheries there are. In terms of what's coming up in the future, by the time this episode comes out, we will have launched a really exciting next raffle that has to do with, actually, we are reproducing a very historically significant reel. So I think we're going to talk a lot about that on the next show, and I think Dan and I might actually be casting some silk lines, and we'll see how that goes. So there's a lot coming up as we get into the fall, and there'll be other stuff going on, but that's definitely one thing that we just people should be getting excited about. We have something really cool coming up soon. And yeah, otherwise it's fall run time. We're getting some great fishing, and yeah, we look forward to seeing everybody next time. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks everybody.